Hi guys, Olive here today to talk to you about the books that I read in February 2023. February was an interesting month. I did get a lot of reading done. I'm very happy about that. It wasn't nearly as much as I was hoping to get done, but weather-wise here in Pittsburgh, it wasn't as bad as I thought it was going to be, so I was out and about a lot more than I was originally anticipating being. But it was the quality of the books that I read in February that was the surprising part. Some books I read I really enjoyed, but others were huge letdowns. We'll talk about it all in this video. So let's start off by discussing fiction. I finally finished a monster of a novel that I began back in January. It took me until February to finish Lost Empress by Sergio de la Pava. This is a highly ambitious novel that begins when the heiress to an NFL dynasty is cheated out of her rightful inheritance by her brother and all of his cronies. Instead of being handed the reins to this NFL team as she should have been, she's instead given control of a New Jersey indoor football league called the Patterson Pork. Her name is Nina Gill, and throughout this novel, we see her try to turn this team, these table scraps that she's been given, she tries to turn this team from a laughingstock into a rival to some of the best NFL teams out there. And then along the way, we also meet this huge web of interconnected characters. So you meet people like a man locked up on Rikers Island, a 911 operator, an EMT, and many others. I like stories with interconnected characters, so I thought that element of this novel would be appealing, but now having finished it, I can honestly say that it could have gone without anybody else besides Nina Gill. Nina Gill is where it's at. She is the character in this novel. She is so entertaining, so forceful, so hilarious. She's like a walking punchline. And I hated being pulled away from her sections to focus on everybody else who, frankly, weren't as interesting as Nina Gill was. It's like I wanted to ask the author, you created this dynamite character who has a really interesting storyline, and you want to complicate that with all these other people? And that is just the thing that got in this author's way. Unnecessary complications. It's like he included all of these characters and all the ways in which they were all connected just to prove that he could, and then he also used unnecessarily elevated language just to prove that he could. At a certain point, it's like, we get it. You're smart. Message received. But you're sabotaging your own book in order to drill that message into your reader's head. So at the end of the day, there were parts of this that I just loved. Like Nina Gill might now be one of my all-time favorite characters, but more often than not, this book was too smart for its own good. Also in February, I picked up The Phantom of the Opera by Gaston Leroux for the very first time. This is a classic Gothic romance all about a ghostly figure that haunts a Paris opera house and how he exerts control over everything and everyone, including the talented new soprano. I didn't know what to expect from this, so I went in with an open mind, and that actually ended up working out really well because I really enjoyed this. Certainly there were parts of it that dragged a little bit, like the whole thing with the opera house managers and the missing money, like that dragged on a little bit too long. But overall, this was so much fun to read. It was definitely the most melodramatic thing I have ever read, but it was so sincere as it was being melodramatic that it was actually very campy, like in the best way possible. I talked more about this book and the Wishbone adaptation of it in my latest installment of my What's the Story Wishbone series. That was a really good episode of Wishbone, and I had so much fun breaking it down. In case you missed it, I will link it for you in the description box below and up in the cards. But there was one more book I read in February that wasn't originally on my February TBR, but I decided to pick it up because there was so much buzz about it. There was so much hype surrounding it that I was dying to see what it was like. It's Big Swiss by Jen Began. This book follows a woman named Greta who works for a sex therapist. She transcribes recordings of people's appointments for this therapist. And through her work, she develops this fixation on one of the patients who she nicknames Big Swiss. But then she accidentally meets Big Swiss at a dog park. She recognizes Big Swiss's voice, and she lies about her own identity in order to be able to continue talking to Big Swiss. Otherwise, she would probably lose her job if the therapist found out that she was talking to one of his patients. And eventually, as she's lying about her identity, the two of them begin an affair. It's a very quirky book that started off really strong. I actually really liked Greta, at least at first. I thought she was very funny. I loved hearing about her past. And I also really liked hearing about the old house that she and her roommate lived in. And then I also really enjoyed getting to know Big Swiss through her appointments, just like Greta was getting to know her. I could see why Greta was growing so interested in Big Swiss because she has a very interesting story. Both of them are very distinct, well-formed characters. But ironically enough, it's when the two of them get together, when they meet for the first time, and then they start becoming involved in a romantic relationship, that's when the novel disintegrated for me. They get involved with one another nearly immediately. There is no buildup, and most importantly, there is no chemistry that I could feel between the two of them. And I feel like that is largely because they're two totally different personality types. Big Swiss is very upright, very stoic, very poised. Meanwhile, Greta is very fly by the seat of your pants, very impulsive, free-spirited, mile-a-minute thought train. I just don't see how those two would ever become attracted to one another. I know they say opposites attract, but I really don't know what they saw in one another because they're just not similar at all. And then when they did get together, it was kind of toxic. They brought out the absolute worst in each other to the point where it eroded at all the things I liked about them in the first half of the novel. So at the end of the day, I don't even know how to feel about this book. How do you rate a book when the first half of it is a 4-star read and the second half of it is a 1-star read for you? I ended up landing on about a 2.75, I guess because I was feeling generous. I really don't understand why this is so hyped up. And to be honest, I ended up feeling very similarly about another very hyped up book that I read during February called I Have Some Questions for You by Rebecca Makkai. This is about a woman in her 40s who goes back to her boarding school alma mater where she went to high school in order to teach a couple of classes, very short term over the winter mini-mester. And while she's there, she starts very quietly reinvestigating the death of one of her classmates who was murdered during their senior year back in the 90s. Parts of this were fun, and the story was interesting enough to keep me going until the very end, but I left this novel feeling very confused about what the author was trying to say about really anything that she brought up in this book. So yes, I too have questions. I talked at length about this book and all of my conflicted feelings about it in the review video that I made for it, which I will link for you in the description box below and up in the cards in case you would like to hear more about it. I also did an in-depth reread of Sense and Sensibility by Jane Austen. I hadn't picked this book up since 2015, and that was my very first experience with a Jane Austen novel, so I was very green. So I thought revisiting this, and not just any edition, but the annotated edition, which gives you so much additional information, I thought that would help me understand this novel a little better and therefore appreciate it more, and that's exactly what ended up happening. In fact, my feelings about the character of Marianne changed almost entirely. I did not like her during my first read through, but this time I feel like I was able to understand more what she was going through at the time. I actually made a whole video about what I think was going on with her within this novel and why I changed my feelings about her. If you're interested in hearing my thoughts, I will link that video for you in the description box below and up in the cards. I was initially very scared to pick up Lakewood by Megan Giddings because I had seen that some people classify it as horror. I am not really a horror reader. I'm a huge scaredy cat. But as it turned out, that's not really what I needed to be concerned about when it came to this novel. This book tells the story of a young woman who is more or less forced by circumstance to become a participant in a medical experimentation program. Like the money is just too good to be able to pass up. And then a lot of weird things happen. And that's really it. There is one interesting revelation right at the end, but other than that, this book is all concept. It's all atmosphere with no actual meat on the bone story-wise. And maybe that works for some readers, but I definitely did not like it. I could see this working if it had been a short story, but I just really don't think this needed to be a novel. The last fiction book I read in February, I had a much better experience with. The Flat Share by Beth O'Leary is a romance that stars two characters who share a one-bedroom flat in London. They work opposite schedules, so they don't actually meet for a good chunk of this novel, and instead they communicate via post-it notes placed all around the apartment. Tiffany just got out of an emotionally abusive relationship that she's still trying to distance herself from, both literally and figuratively, and Leon is busy trying to get his wrongfully convicted brother out of prison. All the while, both of these characters are working full-time jobs, they have families, they have friends, and just slowly over time, they become more important in each other's lives. This was just a really solid romance book. The central plot, the romance between the two characters, was really interesting, but I feel like the side storylines were equally, if not more, interesting than the romance, which I just loved. And then everything about it, even that central premise, which originally felt very unrealistic, everything happened so organically, so naturally in this book. You see the two characters and the side characters going through a lot of hard emotional trials, things that everyday people go through, and then their relationship just naturally changes over time between the two central characters. I really, really enjoyed it. The TV adaptation, however, which I bought an overseas membership to Paramount Plus just to watch it, was a mess. But we'll talk about that in a future video. But now let's move on to nonfiction. I read 2 books on the heart, Pump by Bill Schutt and The Exquisite Machine by Sean Harding. Both of these books are very science-heavy, as you would imagine. They both discuss the most vital of organs, but their approaches were very different. Bill Schutt is a science writer, a very humorous one at that, and in his book, he focuses on hearts in all different kinds of creatures. Of course, there is a focus on the human heart, but he talks about more than just the human heart, whereas Sean Harding, she's a professor of cardiac pharmacology at Imperial College London, so her focus is exclusively on the human heart and all the up-to-date science on the human heart. She has a specific interest in heart disease, so she talks about that a lot in her book. So I would say Bill Schutt's book is a bit more approachable, still very science-heavy, but more approachable, whereas Harding's is a lot more informative, especially if you want to learn about the human heart. But both were very interesting. In February, I also read a pair of memoirs in which the authors discuss their own experiences with alcohol. There was Lit by Mary Carr and Drinking Games by Sarah Levy. Lit is much more of a general memoir in which the author discusses her young adulthood, so going off to college, then getting married, having a baby, and then developing this problem with alcohol. The writing was spectacular. The author has so much personality. It's definitely a very memorable book, but for some reason, I just didn't really jive with it. I don't know what it is, but sometimes I can objectively see that a book is good. Like if I was giving this book a written review, I would give it a positive one because I can see that it's really well done. I just personally don't like it. The same thing happened to me with The Essex Serpent by Sarah Perry. I thought it was a great book. It's just not my style. But I can say that I think Drinking Games was a lot less successful for more objective reasons that I will talk about. This is a memoir in essays in which the author talks about her experiences with alcohol thus far in her life. She is still fairly young, and why she made the choice to get sober. She talks a lot in this book about how she would experience blackouts. She would lose big chunks of time and get into potentially dangerous situations because her brain wasn't really on during those periods. She had blacked out. I did think it was interesting as she was talking about those blackouts. She mentioned a study that suggests that people, when they experience blackouts during their early encounters with alcohol, if they black out when they're fairly young, it kind of trains their brain to black out when they experience alcohol later on in their life, which seems to be what happened for this author. I found that that was pretty much the only time in this book that it kept the promise made by this book's synopsis that it was going to have a larger conversation about alcohol. I was interested in a larger conversation about alcohol, which is why I picked this book up in the first place. but really it's just the author telling her stories, or should I say story, because this author is quite young, and because she stopped drinking fairly early on in her life, there's just not a ton of material, which I think is good for her in her own personal life, but she rehashes a lot of the same material in a lot of the essays, and unfortunately in several of the essays, I found that she lacked some self-awareness. I did find it a little bit odd as she was talking about her blackouts that she says happened on a regular basis, and she said she lived in New York City at the time, and I know how expensive it is to live in New York City. She didn't acknowledge any kind of a safety net, and she definitely didn't point to that safety net as being a reason why she was able to continue living the lifestyle that she was. Like, she said she would regularly lose her phone and her wallet, all of her valuables. But then she didn't at all seem concerned in her essays that she'd be able to make rent or afford another phone. Where is the money coming from that allows you to keep making those types of choices? I don't know about you, but I definitely didn't have that kind of a safety net in my 20s. I definitely don't now that comes from any other source besides myself. So I just would have felt a lot better had she acknowledged that. But then there were two, not one, but two absolutely flabbergasting moments in this memoir that unfortunately really sealed the deal about how I ended up feeling about this author. The first one was when the author was talking about her wedding. She has some relatives overseas, and some of them couldn't make it to her wedding because of travel restrictions due to COVID. Understandably very disappointing. The author talks about calling up this relative, telling the relative how heartbroken she is that they can't be at her wedding. But then the relative reciprocates and says that they too are really let down that they can't be there, that they really, really wanted to be there. And the author actually says that she hadn't even thought that the relative might too be disappointed that they couldn't make it to the wedding. Like, it hadn't even occurred to her. But the second moment is definitely the worst of the two. It's when this author felt comfortable using lines from her neighbor's suicide note that, according to her, she overheard accidentally. So those words weren't even for her ears, but she decided to include them in not just any essay in this collection, but in an essay where she's talking about her addiction to archiving photos on Instagram. I found it completely inappropriate, completely vapid, and it definitely secured my opinion that this author is more than a little self-involved. Thankfully, I saved the best book of the month for last. Cast by Isabel Wilkerson. It's just as good as everyone says it is. In this book, Isabel Wilkerson makes the argument that the United States has been living, continues to live under an unspoken but still very real caste system. And in order to prove this point, she talks about two other caste systems, the one in Nazi Germany, the one in India, and she compares them to what's been going on in the United States. In this book, she talks about the origins of that system, why it got started in the first place, who it serves, how it functions, why it continues, while also incorporating a lot of her own personal experiences as a Black woman in America. It's like in this book, she puts together the pieces of a puzzle that have been right under our noses this entire time. And she's obviously doing so in the hopes that we, person by person, can decide to abandon this system in favor of something better, because our current system is serving none of us. It is a net loss. Her points are inarguable, but honestly, the way she lays them out is the most impressive part, because it was absolutely flawless, just flawlessly done. It wasn't always easy reading, but it was necessary. It's definitely my favorite book of the month and will almost certainly become a top nonfiction read of the year for me. So those were my February reads. Very all over the place in terms of quality, but hey, sometimes it just turns out that way. If you want to read any of the books that I spoke about today, or if you've read them and you want to share your thoughts, I would love to hear from you in the comment section below. All the books that I mentioned today, as well as any other links I promised you throughout this video, will be in the description box below for your clicking convenience. If you're on a mobile device, just tap the title of this video and that box will expand for you. And at the very bottom of that exact same description box, you'll see links to everywhere you can find me around the internets, like Goodreads, Instagram, the Story Graph, all the places where I'm the most active, in case you would like to keep up with what I am reading and writing about right now. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you're having a wonderful day, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.